My name is Susan Hale. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside structured environments, offices with clear hierarchies, polished mission statements, and unspoken rules about who is heard and who is not. People tend to describe me as steady, not loud, not dramatic, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks, who takes notes, who finishes what she's assigned, and rarely asks for credit. I've been called reliable, grounded, and easy to work with. Those words sound flattering on the surface, but they often come with an invisible assumption that I won't push back, that I won't disrupt the flow, that I'll carry weight quietly so others can move faster. This story is about a workplace where power was never shouted, only implied, where control didn't look like cruelty and manipulation wore the mask of leadership. It's about a boss who never raised his voice and never had to. And it's about how subtle authority can shape your sense of self long before you realize it's happening. I want to be clear about what this story is not. This is not a revenge story. There is no dramatic showdown, no public humiliation, no moment where everyone claps. What happened unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, in meeting rooms, email threads, performance reviews, and silences that were easy for everyone else to ignore. What you'll hear is a first-person account of how control can be exercised through praise that limits, expectations that trap, and opportunities that quietly remove choice. It's about how being underestimated can feel safe until it doesn't, and how silence, when chosen consciously, can become something very different from submission. I'm sharing this not to expose one individual, but to document a pattern, one that many people experience but struggle to name, especially those who are competent, calm, and unwilling to play politics loudly. If you've ever felt like your professionalism was used against you, or that your restraint made someone else bolder, parts of this may feel familiar. As the story unfolds, you'll hear how small moments accumulate, how I rationalize things I shouldn't have, how I learned the cost of being low maintenance, and eventually how clarity arrived, not through anger, but through observation. I'm telling this now with distance, not bitterness, with honesty, not embellishment. Some details have been simplified to protect privacy, but the dynamics are real. The emotions are real, and the lessons came at a very real price. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently, without expectation. Have you ever realized, too late, that someone's version of leadership depended on you staying small? To them, I was dependable background noise. That's the most accurate way I can describe it now. Not invisible exactly, but constant enough that no one questioned my presence. I was the person already in the room before meetings started, the one who stayed after to summarize what had just been decided. If something needed to be clarified, fixed, aligned, or quietly smoothed over, my name surfaced without discussion, not because I demanded it, but because it was understood. At work, I held a senior role on paper. My title suggested influence, strategy, and a voice in decisions. In reality, I functioned more like connective tissue. Useful, necessary, but not meant to be seen. My boss liked to introduce me in a very specific way. "This is Susan," he'd say, usually with a polite smile. "She keeps everything running." People nodded, they smiled at me, and then they turned back to him. I noticed early on that I was rarely asked what I thought. Instead, I was asked what I had: data, context, historical memory. I knew how things worked because I'd been there long enough to see patterns form and repeat. I could tell you which initiative would stall, which promise would quietly dissolve, which person would take credit for work they hadn't touched. I just didn't say those things out loud. Not because I was afraid, at least not consciously. It was more than I'd learned. My value came from being unproblematic, from not interrupting the flow, from absorbing complexity so others could remain decisive. When I spoke, it was concise. When I disagreed, it was phrased as a question. When I was overlooked, I told myself it didn't matter as long as the work was solid. My boss seemed to appreciate this arrangement. He trusted me with sensitive information, looped me into plans before they were announced, and relied on me to anticipate issues before they surfaced. From the outside, it looked like respect, and in some ways, it was. But it was a specific kind of respect, the kind that assumes compliance. In meetings, I watched ideas pass through the room like currency. When someone senior spoke, the room leaned in. When I added something, it was often acknowledged indirectly, rephrased, attributed to what we're seeing or what the data suggests. I didn't correct it. I told myself that impact mattered more than recognition. That belief became a habit. People confided in me too. Colleagues would stop by my desk or message me late in the day asking how to navigate him, what he meant by a comment, whether something was a warning or just his way. I listened. I offered perspective without taking sides. I became a quiet translator of power. What I didn't realize then was how that role positioned me. I wasn't a peer. I wasn't a threat. I was a resource. Reliable, useful, contained. My boss never spoke down to me. He didn't need to. He used a softer mechanism, expectation. He assumed I would adapt, that I would fill gaps without being asked, that I would absorb pressure without reflecting it back. And because I often did, the assumption hardened into certainty. There's a particular loneliness in being seen as capable but not influential, in being trusted with responsibility but not authority. I didn't resent it at first. I was proud of my steadiness. I believed that consistency would eventually translate into voice. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit into the story they told about me. Susan doesn't mind. Susan can handle it. Susan will tell us if it's a problem, but I rarely did. Not because I didn't notice, because I didn't think I was supposed to. At that stage, I still believed that if something truly crossed a line, it would be obvious, that leadership abuse would look like aggression, not dependence. That control would feel like force, not familiarity. I was wrong about that. At the time, though, all I knew was this. I was valued, but in a narrow way. Appreciated, but not invited. Present, but rarely centered. And I accepted that version of myself because it felt stable, because it felt earned, because I didn't yet understand the cost of being easy to underestimate. The first moment that stayed with me was so small I almost dismissed it while it was happening. It wasn't public. There was no raised voice, no obvious slight, just a meeting, one of many, where I presented a risk assessment I'd spent days refining. It wasn't dramatic work, but it mattered. It outlined where a proposed initiative would strain our resources, where timelines were unrealistic, and where responsibility was being quietly shifted without acknowledgement. I spoke carefully, the way I always did. I framed concerns as observations. I supported everything with data. I even suggested alternatives so it wouldn't sound like resistance. My boss listened without interrupting. He nodded. He thanked me. Then, after a brief pause, he said, "Let's not overcomplicate this." That was all. The room moved on. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, a difference in style. He was decisive. I was cautious. That's how leadership teams balance each other out. At least that's what I believed. No one else reacted. No one looked at me. My slide deck was skipped without comment. But something about the phrasing lodged itself in my mind. Let's not overcomplicate this. It wasn't a disagreement, it was dismissed. Subtle enough to sound reasonable. Clean enough that if I objected, I'd sound defensive. I felt a faint pressure behind my ribs, the sensation of having been gently pushed aside without permission. After the meeting, a colleague stopped by my desk and said, "I thought your point about resourcing was important." I thanked her. I meant it. And then I did what I always did. I minimized it. "It's fine," I said. "He probably just wants to keep momentum." That was the first small cut, not because of what he said, but because of what followed. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that same initiative referenced in updates without any of the constraints I'd outlined. When timelines slipped, the explanation was vague. When pressure increased, it was framed as unforeseen. No one connected it back to the warnings I'd given, and I didn't remind them. Another moment came during a one-on-one. My boss reviewed my performance positively, as he often did. He praised my reliability, my attention to detail, my ability to keep things grounded. Then he added, almost casually, "You're great at execution. Big picture stuff can get political, and I like that you don't get caught up in that." It was meant as a compliment. I smiled and nodded. Later, alone, I replayed it. Big picture stuff can get political. What he was really saying was that he'd decided where I belonged. Still, I didn't confront it. I didn't even name it to myself as disrespect. I told myself it was a leadership preference, a division of labor. I was good at what I did. He was good at what he did. There was no conflict there, just different lanes. Except the lane he assigned me to kept narrowing. My responsibilities expanded, but my influence didn't. I was asked to implement decisions earlier than before, often before they were finalized. I became the person who made things workable after the vision had already been declared. And slowly, the expectation shifted. I was no longer contributing to decisions. I was validating them. No one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't think it mattered. The environment rewarded speed, confidence, and meilleur, questioning direction, even though was seen as friction. And I had built my reputation on being smooth. What I didn't understand yet was how easily smoothness becomes silence. That first small cut didn't hurt. Not enough to react, not enough to justify discomfort, but it changed how I positioned myself in the room. I spoke a little less. I chose my moments more carefully. I waited to be invited. And the more I adapted, the more natural it seemed to everyone else that this was my place. Years later, when I look back, that moment stands out not because it was cruel, but because it was precise. A single sentence that quietly redrew a boundary, one that only I seemed to feel. And because I didn't challenge it, it stayed. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic changed. That was the problem. Disrespect didn't arrive as an event, it arrived as a pattern. Quiet, repeatable, easy to excuse if you weren't the one accumulating it. My boss continued to rely on me heavily. If anything, his dependence increased. I was looped into more conversations, more planning threads, more late-stage problem solving. On the surface, it looked like trust. And I accepted it as such because questioning trust felt ungrateful. But the shape of our interactions shifted. He stopped asking for my input before decisions were made. Instead, I was asked to pressure test choices that were already emotionally committed. When I flagged concerns, they were acknowledged with phrases like, "Let's see how it goes," or "We'll adjust if needed." Adjustments rarely came. I noticed how he spoke differently to others. With peers, he debated. With executives, he defended. With me, he explained, as if my role was to understand, not to influence. I became the person he clarified things to, not the person he clarified things with. At first, I told myself this was maturity, that I'd grown past needing validation, that my work spoke for itself. There's a quiet pride in being the one who doesn't need to be seen to be effective. But pride has a way of blinding you to erosion. In meetings, interruptions became normal, not aggressive ones, just timing. I'd begin a sentence and someone would jump in to finish it differently. My boss rarely redirected the floor back to me. Sometimes he'd restate my point later, as if it had just occurred to him. I noticed. I always noticed. What changed was how I responded internally. I stopped marking these moments as problems. I reframed them as efficiencies. The idea landed, I think. That's what matters. I began to edit myself in advance. I shortened my comments, removed nuance. Choose a language that aligns with the direction already set. When I disagreed, I softened it so much that it barely registered as disagreement at all. And when I felt the faint sting of being overlooked, I explained it away. He's under pressure. This isn't personal. Not every role needs visibility. The truth was harder to admit. It was easier to stay quiet than to risk being labeled difficult. I'd seen what happened to people who pushed too hard. They weren't fired. They were sidelined, excluded from early conversations, branded as not strategic or too emotional. I told myself I was choosing stability, that I was playing a long game, that patience would eventually pay off. Meanwhile, the environment adjusted to my silence. My boss began to assume alignment without checking. He volunteered me for responsibilities without asking. He spoke about my work as if it were an extension of his own thinking, and I let him. There was one moment I remember clearly. A cross-functional meeting where a decision was made that contradicted months of operational constraints I documented. I spoke up, carefully, pointing out the misalignment. My boss smiled, almost indulgently, and said, "Susan worries about these things so we don't have to." The room laughed lightly. I smiled too. That laugh did more damage than any reprimand could have. It reframed my concern as a personality trait, not a professional insight. It taught everyone else how to interpret me. Cautious, detail-focused, not quite leadership material. After that, I spoke even less. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through accommodation, through the small internal negotiations you make to keep the peace, through the belief that endurance is a virtue. I started to measure my success by how little friction I caused, by how smoothly things moved after I stepped in, by how often I was thanked privately, even if I was ignored publicly. And because I was rewarded with appreciation, with job security, with the reassurance that I was trusted, I ignored the growing imbalance. What I didn't see then was how power works when it's subtle. It doesn't force silence. It rewards it. It makes you complicit in your own marginalization by convincing you that restraint is wisdom. By the time I noticed how much ground I'd ceded, the pattern felt established, familiar, almost reasonable. And breaking a pattern like that doesn't start with anger. It starts with discomfort you can no longer explain away. There comes a point where you don't just notice how others treat you, you recognize the part you've been cast in. For me, that realization arrived quietly, without confrontation or clarity. It surfaced in the language people used when they spoke about me, especially when I wasn't in the room. I was solid, low ego, someone you can count on. Those words followed me everywhere. They were meant as praise, and for a long time I accepted them as such. But eventually I heard what they excluded. No one said visionary. No one said leader. No one said challenge. I had become the safe option. My boss leaned into that safety. He structured work around my predictability. If an initiative was risky, I was assigned to stabilize it. If a plan was vague, I was brought in to translate it into something executable. If tensions rose between teams, I was asked to smooth them over. I wasn't shaping direction, I was absorbing consequences. And because I did it well, the role solidified. I remember being left out of a strategic offsite, one I should have attended based on my scope. When I asked about it afterward, my boss looked genuinely surprised. "Oh," he said, "we didn't think you'd want to sit through all that. It was pretty high level." High level. He said it kindly, almost protectively, as if he were sparing me something. I nodded and said it was fine, that I trusted his judgment. Later that evening, I sat with that moment longer than I should have. Not angry, just unsettled. Because it wasn't the exclusion itself that hurt, it was the assumption behind it. That I was there to support, not to steer. That my comfort mattered more than my contribution. My role was to make other people's decisions successful, not to influence what those decisions were. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. In meetings, my contributions were treated as utilities, helpful but interchangeable. My boss often summarized discussions and moved on without checking whether I agreed. When I followed up privately with concerns, he'd reassure me without adjusting course. "You always catch the details," he'd say. "That's why I trust you." Trust in this context meant containment. I wasn't being silenced, I was being placed, given a defined perimeter and praised for staying within it. And because the perimeter was drawn with politeness, I hadn't resisted. There's a particular dynamic that happens when you're seen as dependable but not directional. People stop testing your ideas. They stop asking for your opinion in ambiguous moments. They assume you'll adapt to whatever's decided. I became the person others felt comfortable disappointing. And I let that happen because I believed that consistency would eventually earn expansion. That if I proved myself indispensable enough, influence would follow naturally. What I didn't understand was that indispensability can be a trap. The more I became associated with stability, the less room there was for me to disrupt, even when disruption was necessary. My boss didn't need to assert authority over me. He simply leaned on the identity I'd already accepted. The responsible one, the composed one, the one who wouldn't rock the boat. And because I lived up to that identity, he never had to adjust. This wasn't abuse in the way people imagine it. There were no insults, no threats, just a gradual narrowing of expectation, a role that rewarded reliability while quietly excluding agency. By the time I named it internally, it felt entrenched. This was who I was to them. The system had adapted around that version of me. The question wasn't whether I saw it. The question was whether I was willing to stay inside it. At that point, I still thought awareness was enough. Simply knowing the role would protect me from its consequences. I hadn't yet learned that awareness without action changes very little. The day something shifted didn't come with a speech or a decision. It came with a silence. I was sitting alone in a conference room after everyone else had left. The meeting had ended early, not because we'd resolved anything, but because my boss had decided we were aligned enough to move forward. I remember staring at the blank screen at the end of the table, my notes still open, my pen uncapped. No one had asked me if I agreed. That wasn't new. What was new was that I didn't immediately rationalize it. Usually my mind would move quickly to justification. He's under pressure, time is limited, we'll adjust later. That day, none of those explanations settled. They hovered, thin and unconvincing, like excuses that had been used too many times. I replayed the meeting in my head, not emotionally, but precisely. Who spoke? Who decided? Who nodded? Who was summarized instead of heard? And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for years. If I weren't here, what would actually change? The answer came faster than I expected. Not much, at least not in the way that would be visible immediately. Decisions would still be made. Meetings would still happen. My absence wouldn't stop the machine. But then I thought more carefully. Certain risks would go undocumented, certain assumptions would go unchallenged, certain failures would arrive without warning. The organization would continue forward, but it would do so blindly in specific places. That's when I realized something important. My value wasn't being recognized. It was being used. And not maliciously, not consciously perhaps, but consistently. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel betrayed. What I felt was clarity, cold, steady, unmistakable. The kind of clarity that doesn't demand action immediately, but makes inaction impossible to ignore. I closed my notebook and sat back. For years, I'd believed that speaking up was the only form of agency, that if I wanted change, I had to confront, to assert, to push. But that day, something subtler occurred to me. I had already been speaking. In documents, in emails, in risk logs and implementation plans, in quiet records of how decisions were made and who made them. I'd been listening carefully too, watching patterns, noting inconsistencies, tracking how accountability shifted depending on who was in the room. I just hadn't framed any of it as leverage. That day, I didn't decide to do anything. I decided to stop doing something. I stopped filling in the gaps automatically. Stopped translating ambiguity into clarity without acknowledgement. Stopped preemptively protecting decisions I didn't agree with. Not publicly, not dramatically, just internally. I began to notice how often silence was assumed to mean consent. How quickly momentum replaced discussion, how rarely anyone checked whether I was aligned because they'd learned they didn't have to. That realization was unsettling, but it was also grounding. It returned agency to a place I'd forgotten it existed. Choice. I didn't confront my boss. I didn't schedule a meeting or draft a carefully worded email. I didn't need to. The shift wasn't about him. It was about me withdrawing something invisible. My automatic compliance, my emotional cushioning, my reflexive willingness to make things work at my own expense. I went back to my desk and answered messages as usual. I smiled when people stopped by. I delivered what I was asked for, exactly what I was asked for. Nothing more. And in that restraint, something settled into place. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting an exit. I was simply observing, this time without self-blame, without excuses, without the assumption that I needed to earn my right to be heard. The shift wasn't loud enough for anyone else to notice, but from that day on, I was no longer unaware of my position. And once you see the mechanics clearly, you can't unknow them. That was the day the story changed direction. Not outwardly, internally. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been automatic, an instinct shaped by years of reinforcement. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. And because it looked the same from the outside, no one questioned it. That was its power. I began to notice how often people filled the space I left. When I didn't step in to clarify, assumptions went untested. When I didn't volunteer context, conversations moved faster and in the wrong direction. My boss in particular seemed to mistake my restraint for alignment. He grew more confident in decisions he hadn't fully thought through. He spoke with certainty about outcomes that were at best optimistic. And because I didn't interrupt, he assumed I agreed. I let him, not out of spite, out of precision. I still did my job well. I met deadlines. I documented risks when asked. but I stopped anticipating needs that weren't mine to carry. I stopped translating his intentions into operational reality unless it was explicitly part of my role. This wasn't passive aggression, it was boundary enforcement without announcement. What surprised me was how quickly others adapted. Meetings grew shorter, decisions were made with less friction. People praised the efficiency. No one noticed what had been removed from the process, because it had never been formally acknowledged in the first place. My boss seemed pleased. He commented once, "You've been really streamlined lately. I appreciate that you're trusting the direction." I nodded. Inside, I noted the phrasing. Trusting the direction, not contributing to it, not shaping it. He had mistaken my withdrawal for deference, and that misunderstanding created space. I used that space to observe more closely. I paid attention to how accountability was distributed, who signed off, who presented, who absorbed fallout when things didn't land as promised. I began keeping more detailed records, not just of tasks, but of conversations, dates, language, decisions that were framed as collaborative but enacted unilaterally. None of this was new information. I'd always noticed it. The difference was that I was no longer smoothing it over emotionally. I was preserving it. There's a moment when people in power grow careless, not because they're malicious, but because they believe the system around them is stable. My boss reached that moment slowly. He delegated more, explained less, made assumptions about my support without checking. And because I didn't challenge him, his confidence grew. I saw how silence can function as a mirror. People project onto it what they want to see: agreement, loyalty, weakness. He saw weakness. That perception insulated me. While he focused outward, on visibility, on narrative, on upward influence, I focused inward, on accuracy, on traceability, on understanding exactly how decisions traveled through the organization and where responsibility landed when they failed. I didn't feel powerful. I felt grounded. This wasn't about winning. It was about no longer losing myself to accommodation, about reclaiming authorship over my participation. There were moments when I considered speaking up again, correcting a misstep before it widened, but I stopped myself, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I had spent years protecting a system that didn't protect me. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not absence. It's presence without performance. It reveals what others rely on you for and what they assume you'll always provide. My boss continued as if nothing had changed. That was the point. He didn't realize that the version of me he depended on was no longer fully available. And because he mistook that withdrawal for compliance, he never adjusted. By the time he sensed something was off, the groundwork had already been laid, quietly, patiently, without a single confrontation. What they never noticed was how much I already knew. For years, I had been absorbing information simply because it was part of my role. I understood systems the way some people understand personalities, intuitively, through repetition and pattern. I knew which approvals were symbolic and which were binding. I knew where decisions were documented and where they were only implied. I knew how language shifted when accountability needed to blur. None of that was new. What changed was how intentionally I organized it. I didn't announce a strategy. I didn't even think of it as one at first. I began by cleaning up my own work, structuring files, annotating timelines, and cross-referencing emails with outcomes. Not obsessively, methodically. When a decision was made in a meeting, I noted who initiated it, who endorsed it, and how it was later described. When my boss framed something as aligned, I checked whether alignment had actually been confirmed or merely assumed. When risks were dismissed verbally but acknowledged in writing, I saved both. This wasn't about collecting evidence in the dramatic sense. It was about accuracy. There's a difference. Accuracy strips away narrative. It leaves only the sequence. I also paid attention to what wasn't documented, the informal conversations where direction shifted, the assumptions that never made it into official records, the moments when my boss spoke for me in rooms I wasn't in. I couldn't control those things, but I could note when they happened and what followed. At the same time, I began learning, quietly, in the margins of my day. Not about my job, which I already knew well, but about structure, policy, governance, how accountability is defined when things go wrong, what organizations rely on when intentions and outcomes diverge. None of this required secrecy. I wasn't hiding. I was simply no longer advertising my thinking. People tend not to notice preparation when it looks like routine competence. My boss, in particular, remained comfortable. He continued to delegate complex pieces of work to me without context, assuming I would connect the dots as I always had. He trusted that I'd protect the integrity of the system even when he cut corners. And for a time I did, just enough to keep things running. But I stopped absorbing responsibility that wasn't formally assigned to me. I stopped being the silent guarantor of decisions I didn't own. When something fell outside my scope, I let it remain outside. Others noticed small frictions, but they attributed them to growth, to scale, to external pressure. No one traced them back to me. That invisibility was my positioning. I also noticed how often my boss relied on my presence as reassurance. He would speak more confidently when I was in the room, glance at me when making claims about feasibility, and assume my quiet agreement. I didn't correct him. Not because he was always wrong, but because he had grown accustomed to my correction happening privately later. I removed that safety net. The system began to reveal its own weak points. What surprised me most was how little effort this required. I wasn't working harder. I was working differently, more precisely, more bounded. The emotional labor dropped away first. I stopped carrying anxiety for outcomes I couldn't control. I stopped internalizing pressure that wasn't mine to bear. In its place came something steadier, detachment. Not apathy, clarity. I also paid attention to how power reacted to silence. My boss began speaking more, explaining more, filling the space that I no longer did. He assumed the role of authority more fully, without the grounding effect my presence used to provide. And in doing so, he left clearer footprints. People often think preparation looks like aggression, like plotting or scheming. In reality, it often looks like restraint, like patience, like letting systems behave exactly as designed. I didn't need to set a trap. I simply stopped shielding flaws that weren't mine to fix. Over time, I realized I was holding something valuable, not leverage in the dramatic sense, but position. A clear understanding of how responsibility flowed and where it stalled, of how my role had been used to stabilize decisions without empowering me to shape them. That knowledge changed how I saw myself. I wasn't powerless. I had never been. I had been contained, and I had accepted that containment because it felt safer than challenging it. Now, I was no longer contained. I was observing from within. They didn't notice the shift because it didn't announce itself. It didn't disrupt. It didn't demand attention. It simply waited. The private reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By then, I had been observing long enough to recognize when a pattern crossed into something structural. It happened one afternoon as I reviewed a sequence of documents tied to a stalled initiative, one that had been publicly framed as collaborative, but privately driven by my boss alone. I wasn't looking for fault. I was reconciling timelines. That's when I noticed it. A decision that had been verbally attributed to the team had never actually been approved by the committee listed in the summary. The language implied consensus, but the records told a different story. The risk sign-off was incomplete. The accountability chain was ambiguous by design. On its own, it meant little. These things happen in fast-moving organizations. But when I followed the thread backward, I saw the same structure repeated. Different projects, same pattern. Decisions framed as shared. Responsibility is distributed downward. Authority retained upward. And threaded through all of it, quietly, consistently, was my role. I had been the stabilizer, the interpreter, the person who ensured execution aligned with whatever narrative was currently being used. My work created the appearance of cohesion where there was, in fact, fragmentation. That was the moment I understood what I was holding. Not a secret, not a weapon, a truth with context. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sober. Because leverage, when you recognize it honestly, is not exciting. It's heavy. It carries responsibility. It forces you to decide what kind of person you are when you could act. I sat there for a long time, not moving, not rushing to conclusions. I asked myself questions that mattered. What did I want? Not revenge, not validation. I wanted alignment between responsibility and authority, between expectation and agency, between how my work was used and how my voice was treated. And I realized something else. The leverage wasn't just in the documentation. It was in my position. In fact, I understood the system more clearly than the people who relied on it. In the fact that I had been trusted precisely because I was quiet, and that trust had created exposure. My boss didn't see this because he didn't need to. From his perspective, things were working. He believed the narrative he told others, and because I had supported it for so long, he believed I would continue to. I closed the files and made no immediate plans. That's important. There was no celebration, no internal monologue about finally having him, no sense of power rising. Instead, there was restraint. I understood that leverage used impulsively collapses quickly. That is the moment you act out of emotion, you lose clarity, and clarity was the only thing that had protected me so far. So I did nothing outwardly. I continued working, continued attending meetings, continued documenting decisions as requested. But internally, something had crystallized. I no longer saw myself as someone waiting to be recognized. I saw myself as someone who had been structurally necessary without being structurally respected. And once you see that, you can't pretend the imbalance is accidental. I also understood that whatever I chose next would be irreversible. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet way systems shift once reality is acknowledged. There was no going back to believing this was just a personality mismatch, or a communication issue, or something patience would fix. This was about design, and I was standing at a point where design could be corrected or left to fail on its own terms. That night, I went home and slept normally. No racing thoughts, no rehearsed conversations, just a deep, calm exhaustion, the kind that follows understanding, not stress. The reveal didn't change my behavior overnight. It changed my orientation. From that point on, every choice I made was informed by one question. Am I protecting a system that excludes me, or am I finally protecting myself? The answer to that question would shape everything that followed. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of choice. I knew that, and still I allowed myself time, not out of fear, but out of respect for the consequences. Every option available to me carried weight, and I needed to understand that weight fully before moving. There were, broadly speaking, 3 paths. The first was confrontation. A direct conversation with my boss, carefully structured, supported by documentation. I could name the imbalance, point to patterns, and ask for formal authority to match the responsibility I carried. It was the cleanest option on paper, the one most leadership books would recommend. But I'd been around long enough to know how that usually ended. Not explosively, quietly, with assurances, reframing, and promises of future consideration. With the burden subtly shifted back onto me to be patient or help him grow. Confrontation would place me back inside the same dynamic, just with more risk. The second option was exit. I could leave, take my skills elsewhere, protect my integrity by removing myself from the system entirely. Many people would call that the healthiest choice. But leaving would erase context. It would preserve the narrative that everything had been fine, that my departure was simply personal preference or career progression. The pattern would continue unchanged, just without me there to witness it. And the third option was something quieter. I could stop propping up a system that relied on my silence while denying me agency. I could allow structure, not emotion, to surface the imbalance. I could make myself fully accountable only for what I formally owned and let everything else follow its natural course. This option didn't require accusation. It didn't require explanation. It didn't require permission. It required patience. I spent weeks sitting with these choices, not dramatizing them, just testing them mentally against reality. Which one aligned with my values? Which one preserved my integrity without asking me to shrink or explode? The answer became obvious once I stopped asking which option felt safest and started asking which one was honest. Confrontation assumed my boss was unaware. He wasn't. Exit assumed the system deserved protection from exposure. It didn't. The third option assumed something simpler, that I was allowed to stop compensating for structural failure. That was the irreversible choice. From that point on, I made a decision that would quietly alter everything. I would operate strictly within the boundaries of my role, my authority, and my documented responsibilities. No more interpretive labor, no more invisible stabilization, no more emotional buffering. If something required escalation, I escalated it formally. If something lacked approval, I noted it and waited. If something failed because clarity was absent, I documented that absence. I wasn't withdrawing competence, I was withdrawing coverage. And once you stop covering for a system, it begins to reveal itself. This choice didn't feel dramatic, it felt adult, measured, ethical. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was aligning my behavior with reality. The hardest part was resisting the urge to rescue. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. There were moments when I saw issues forming and wanted to step in to smooth things over before they became visible. Each time I asked myself the same question: is this my responsibility or is it simply familiar? If it wasn't mine, I let it stand. That's when I understood how deeply I'd been trained to confuse usefulness with worth. How often I'd equated being needed with being valued. This decision broke that equation. And because it did, it couldn't be undone. There was no going back to unconscious compliance, no returning to the comfort of being quietly indispensable. I had crossed a line internally from participation to authorship. No one else knew yet, not my boss, not my colleagues, not even myself fully. But something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't waiting to be treated differently. I was behaving differently. And systems respond to behavior long before they respond to words. Once the decision was made, everything became quieter. Not externally. Meetings still happened, emails still flowed, deadlines still existed. But internally, the noise dropped away. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head anymore. I wasn't bracing for dismissal or imagining outcomes. I was simply executing within clearly defined limits. That clarity changed how I moved. I began formalizing things that had previously lived in ambiguity. When tasks were assigned verbally, I followed up in writing. When decisions were implied, I asked for confirmation, not challengingly, just neutrally. When timelines were unrealistic, I flagged constraints early and documented responses. None of this was confrontational, it was procedural. And because I'd always been seen as detail-oriented, no one questioned the shift. My boss interpreted it as diligence, others saw it as professionalism. What they didn't see was how those small adjustments rerouted accountability. I stopped attending meetings where my presence wasn't essential, not by declining outright, but by asking clarifying questions about my role in them. If there was no clear answer, I opted out. Time I'd once donated freely was now spent consolidating my responsibilities and ensuring they were explicitly defined. I also stopped correcting course privately. Before, if something went off track, I'd quietly intervene, coaching, clarifying, absorbing friction so the system appeared functional. Now, if an issue fell outside my scope, I escalated it formally or let it surface. This wasn't neglect, it was alignment. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Projects began to move more slowly, not because I withheld effort, but because the informal shortcuts I'd provided were no longer available. Decisions that had relied on my interpretive labor now required explicit coordination. My boss didn't notice at first. Why would he? From his perspective, I was still delivering. Still composed, still supportive. The absence of my invisible work registered only as general friction, something he attributed to external factors. I let him. I also took care to protect myself. I reviewed policies, clarified reporting lines, ensured my work was traceable and my boundaries documented. If a decision carried risk, I made sure that risk was visible and acknowledged by the appropriate authority. I wasn't building a case, I was building alignment between action and ownership. There's a misconception that moving in silence means hiding. In reality, it often means acting so consistently with structure that no one questions you. I wasn't secretive, I was exact. Emotionally, this phase was steadier than I expected. Without the burden of emotional translation, my energy returned. I slept better. I felt less responsible for outcomes I couldn't control. And interestingly, people began to adjust around me. Colleagues asked clearer questions. They looped in decision makers earlier. They stopped assuming I'd handle it without context. My absence from certain conversations forced others to step into clarity. My boss, however, continued as before. He spoke with confidence about plans that were increasingly brittle. He relied on alignment that no longer existed. And because I didn't contradict him publicly, he assumed support. That assumption would matter later. For now, everything looked normal. That's what made this phase dangerous. Not for me, but for the system. When invisible labor is withdrawn quietly, the surface remains calm while the structure weakens beneath it. I didn't feel powerful during this time. I felt responsible to myself, to my ethics, to the truth of my role. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about refusing to perform stability for systems that haven't earned it. And because no one noticed yet, they also didn't intervene. They thought nothing had changed. They were wrong. The consequences didn't arrive as a collapse. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up in small ways. Questions that lingered longer than usual, decisions that stalled without explanation, meetings that ended without clear next steps. People began circling the same issues, revisiting conversations they thought were already settled. I watched it happen from inside the same system, but from a different position. Colleagues started to sound uncertain. Not panicked, just unsettled. They asked for clarification more often. They escalated things that previously would have been resolved informally. There was a subtle shift in tone, a loss of momentum that no one could quite name. "What's holding this up?" someone asked during a meeting. No one answered directly. The truth was simple. The informal infrastructure I had quietly maintained for years was no longer absorbing friction. Decisions now had to stand on their own clarity, and many of them didn't. My boss noticed the slowdown, but he misdiagnosed it. He blamed the process. He blamed scale. He blamed external dependencies. He pushed harder for speed, for alignment, for execution. What he didn't do was look inward. He scheduled more meetings, sent more follow-ups, reiterated expectations, and each time I responded professionally, accurately within scope, without interpretation. When he asked why something hadn't progressed as expected, I pointed to the documentation, to approvals that hadn't been confirmed, to risks that had been acknowledged but not resolved. I didn't accuse, I referenced. That distinction mattered. People began to feel the absence of something they'd never known was there. They couldn't articulate it, but they sensed it. The system felt less forgiving, less elastic. Errors surfaced more visibly. Assumptions were challenged by reality rather than smoothed over by effort. A colleague pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "Things feel harder lately. Have you noticed that?" I nodded. "We're growing," I said, which was true. What I didn't say was that growth exposes weak design. My boss became more directive, less curious. He spoke with certainty to compensate for instability. In meetings, he filled the silence quickly, summarizing, deciding, moving on. And because I didn't interrupt, those decisions stood until they didn't. Deadlines slipped, dependencies clashed. Accountability became murky. People began to feel pressure without understanding its source. They worked harder, but outcomes didn't improve. The loss wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative, and still no one traced it back to me. That's the strange thing about invisible labor. When it's present, it's taken for granted. When it's gone, the discomfort is attributed to everything except its absence. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction, but with focus. I made sure my own work was clean, documented, and defensible. I supported colleagues when asked, but I didn't step outside my role to rescue outcomes that weren't mine. This wasn't detachment, it was discipline. There were moments when my boss's frustration edged toward irritation, not at me directly, but at the system. He spoke about losing alignment, about people not taking ownership. Each time I listened, because ownership had always been the issue. One afternoon, he asked me privately, "Do you feel like things are slipping?" I considered my answer carefully. "I think we're seeing where clarity was assumed," I said. "And where it wasn't?" He frowned, nodded, and moved on. He still didn't see it. The consequences continued to unfold, not explosively, but steadily. Trust thinned. Confidence wavered. The gap between narrative and reality widened. And through it all, I remained calm. Not because I was unaffected, but because I was no longer carrying what didn't belong to me. That's when I understood something important. The system wasn't reacting to me doing something new. It was reacting to me no longer doing something old. And once that absence is felt, it can't be unfelt. By the time my boss realized something was wrong, the damage wasn't dramatic enough to name, and that made it impossible to fix. There was no single failure he could point to. No moment where everything broke at once. Just a growing sense that things were slipping out of his control even as he tried harder to assert it. He began asking more questions, not the curious kind, the corrective kind. He wanted to know why things weren't moving the way they used to. Why did teams seem hesitant? Why did execution feel heavier? And slowly, almost imperceptibly, his attention turned toward me. not with accusation, with confusion. He scheduled a one-on-one that felt different from the others, less polished, less confident. He opened with reassurance, how much he valued my work, how important I was to the organization. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. I feel like I don't always know where things stand anymore. I listened. In the past, I would have filled that gap for him, reconstructed clarity from fragments, interpreted signals, taken responsibility for restoring his sense of control. This time I didn't. Instead, I responded with facts, status updates, references to documented decisions, clear delineations of what had been approved and what was still pending. No translation, no emotional cushioning. He nodded slowly, but I could see the unease. He was used to feeling informed even when he hadn't done the informing, used to certainty being delivered quietly, without friction. That certainty was gone. Over the following weeks, his behavior shifted. He looped himself into more details, asked to be copied on everything, sought alignment after the fact. It was an attempt to reassert control, but it came too late. The system had already adjusted to a different rhythm, one where ambiguity surfaced instead of being absorbed. He also began reaching out more personally, casual check-ins, comments about how long we'd worked together, subtle reminders of trust and loyalty. I heard them for what they were, attempts to restore a dynamic that no longer existed. Because trust built on silence only works as long as the silence remains unconscious. I stayed polite, professional, steady, but I didn't return to the old role. The panic didn't look like panic. It looked like overcorrection, like urgency without clarity, like decisions made faster, not better. He tried to simplify complexity instead of understanding it, and that only exposed more cracks. Colleagues began questioning direction openly, not rebelliously, but practically. They wanted clarity that wasn't there, accountability that wasn't defined. The confidence that had once come from momentum now felt hollow. My boss felt it slipping. I could see it in how he spoke, more declarative, less grounded. He wasn't adjusting the structure, he was defending it. At one point, he said to me, "I don't know when things got so complicated." I did, but explaining it wouldn't help, because the complication wasn't new. It had simply been hidden by me. And here's the truth that's hardest to accept. Once a system has relied on someone's unacknowledged labor for too long, it loses the ability to function without it. Not because that person was indispensable, but because the system was never designed honestly in the first place. By the time my boss tried to fix things through more meetings, more oversight, more pressure, the conditions that allowed him to feel in control were already gone. He didn't need better communication. He needed a different structure. And restructuring would have required admitting that authority and responsibility had been misaligned for years, that the stability he relied on had been quietly outsourced to someone he never fully empowered. That kind of admission rarely happens voluntarily. So instead, he doubled down. And in doing so, he made the final outcome unavoidable. I watched all of this without triumph, without satisfaction, just recognition. It was too late to fix because fixing would have required acknowledging the very imbalance he had benefited from, and I was no longer willing to pretend it didn't exist. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment where I finally said everything I'd been holding in. If anything, it felt understated, almost administrative. My boss asked for a meeting late one afternoon. His message was brief, neutral. I recognized the tone immediately, controlled, careful, slightly defensive. When I walked into his office, he was already seated, hands folded, a document open on his screen. He gestured for me to sit. The door remained open. That detail mattered. He started by talking about alignment, about the need to reset expectations, about how the organization was evolving and how roles sometimes needed to be rebalanced. I listened without interrupting. Then he said, "I want to understand how you see your role right now." It was the first time in years he'd asked that question directly. I didn't rush to answer. I didn't soften my words. I didn't inflate them either. "I see my role as the responsibilities I'm formally accountable for," I said, "and I operate within those." He nodded slowly, as if that made sense, and also didn't. He asked whether I felt disengaged. "No," I said, "I feel precise." That word landed differently than I expected. He looked at me for a moment, then glanced back at his screen. He mentioned that some things hadn't progressed as anticipated, that there seemed to be gaps. He didn't say my name, but it was clear what he was circling. I responded by referencing documentation, timelines, decisions, approvals. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain the context, which he hadn't asked for. I simply stated facts. At one point he said, "You used to be more proactive." I met his eyes. "I was operating beyond my scope," I said calmly. "That wasn't sustainable." There was a pause then, not a dramatic one, just long enough for something unspoken to surface. He realized in that moment that I wasn't confused, that I wasn't emotional, that I wasn't asking for reassurance or recognition. I was stating a boundary that already existed. He tried once more, softly, to reframe, to suggest that flexibility was part of leadership, that stepping in was a sign of commitment. "I agree," I said, "when authority and accountability are aligned." That was the closest I came to confrontation. There was no argument after that, just a subtle shift in posture, a recognition that whatever leverage he'd once had over me, through expectation, through familiarity, through my own restraint, was gone. We ended the meeting professionally, cordially. He thanked me for my transparency. I thanked him for the conversation. When I walked out, I didn't feel relief. I felt finished, not with the job necessarily, but with the version of myself that had been waiting for permission to be treated differently. The confrontation worked precisely because it lacked heat. There was nothing to react against, no emotion to dismiss, no tone to critique. Just clarity. And clarity is difficult to argue with. Who I am now is quieter than who I used to be, but not smaller. After that conversation, nothing externally dramatic happened. I wasn't punished. I wasn't praised. The organization adjusted in small bureaucratic ways. Lines were redrawn, responsibilities clarified. Some expectations were formally reassigned. Others simply fell away. What changed most wasn't my role. It was my relationship with myself. For a long time, I had defined my value by how well I could carry weight without complaint. I took pride in being the one who could handle complexity, tension, ambiguity, without asking for much in return. That identity felt strong, even noble. Now I see it differently. It wasn't strength that kept me quiet. It was conditioning. A learned belief that composure was safer than assertion, that usefulness would eventually be rewarded, that patience was always virtuous. I don't hold anger toward my former boss. That surprises people when I tell them. Anger would suggest surprise or betrayal. I felt neither. He operated within a system that rewarded exactly the behavior he exhibited, and I participated in that system longer than I should have. That accountability is mine. What I no longer do is confuse calm with compliance. I still work with focus. I still value precision, but I no longer absorb ambiguity as a favor. I don't translate power for others at my own expense. When I speak now, it's because my voice belongs in the room, not because it will make things easier for someone else. There's a particular peace that comes from that alignment. I'm not louder. I'm clearer. I ask questions without cushioning them. I state limits without apology. I document not to protect myself from fear, but to honor reality. I no longer measure success by how invisible I can be while holding everything together. And perhaps most importantly, I don't wait for recognition to validate my position. If a system requires my silence to function, I know it's not designed for integrity. That understanding changed how I move through every environment now, not just work. I notice when people rely on my steadiness without offering reciprocity, when they lean without listening, when expectations are placed instead of negotiated. And I respond differently, not with confrontation, with choice. I choose where to invest, where to speak, where to step back. That choice is quiet, but it's firm. It's no longer reactive. It's intentional. Looking back, I don't regret staying as long as I did. I learned how power really works when it doesn't announce itself. I learned how easily competence can be exploited when it's paired with restraint. And I learned that dignity isn't something you demand, it's something you stop giving away. Who I am now is someone who understands that silence is not the absence of power. It's only dangerous when it's unconscious. There's a quiet kind of harm that doesn't leave bruises or dramatic stories behind. It leaves confusion, self-doubt, a slow erosion of identity that's hard to explain because nothing ever feels bad enough. And that's what makes it so effective. What I experienced wasn't overt abuse. It was something subtler and in many ways more dangerous. It was a system that rewarded silence, praised reliability, and quietly trained people like me to believe that not needing recognition was a virtue. The moral of this story isn't that my boss was a villain. It's that power doesn't need cruelty to be destructive. It only needs imbalance, especially when that imbalance is stabilized by someone who believes their restraint is maturity. I learned that quiet competence can be used as a tool of control when it's paired with unspoken expectations. That being trusted without being empowered is not respect, it's convenience. And that is when you are always the one making things work. You may be preventing others from ever having to take responsibility. The most important lesson I carry forward is this: silence is not strength unless it is chosen. When silence is automatic, it becomes a currency others spend on your behalf. When it's deliberate, it becomes a boundary. The difference between the two is awareness and the willingness to stop protecting systems that don't protect you back. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I reclaimed authorship, and that matters more than validation, applause, or revenge ever could. If you're listening to this and feeling unsettled, I want you to know something. That discomfort isn't weakness. It's information. It's often the first signal that your steadiness is being mistaken for consent or your professionalism for compliance. You don't need to explode to regain power. You don't need to explain yourself endlessly. You don't need to prove your worth by carrying more than your share. Sometimes the most ethical thing you can do is step back and let reality speak for itself. I'm sharing this story not to offer a template, but to offer language. Because once you can name what's happening, you're no longer trapped inside it. And I'm curious, truly without judgment, have you ever realized that your silence was doing more work for others than it was doing for you? If this story resonated, I'd like to hear how you recognize that moment, or if you're still standing on the edge of it.